For Chapter 12, we're looking at cardiorespiratory anatomy and physiology. And this is another longer chapter like Chapter 11. So I'm going to break it up into different chunks of videos, and I encourage you to pause and take breaks whenever you want as you go through. We'll start with our bit of anatomy, and we'll look at the pulmonary and systemic circulation. So majority of our activities, including most of our exercise routines, occur at power outputs that are supplied by our oxidative or aerobic system. So we should start with our basic anatomy of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems, as well as our mechanisms of oxygen transport, so that we understand the physiology of what powers our exercise. And it also helps us understand how our endurance programs can improve our aerobic ability, and also helps us to design effective programs and understand both the acute responses and chronic adaptations to exercise. So our pulmonary and systemic circulation is the most important system of the body in reducing the occurrence of heart disease. So our cardiovascular system is divided into two parts, and that's what you can see here on figure 12.1. In our pulmonary circulation, deoxygenated blood is pumped from the heart through the lungs, and then oxygenated blood is returned back to the heart. In our systemic circulation, oxygenated blood is pumped from the heart around the rest of the body, and then deoxygenated blood is returned back to the heart. So you can see there's two separate colors here on the figure. And typically in texts or graphs and charts, the red is going to indicate blood that is oxygen rich, and the blue is going to indicate blood that's oxygen poor. And the oxygen gets picked up by our tissues, and then the blood that's sent back to the heart is deoxygenated. And this is a closed loop circuit. When we look at the circulatory system, in under a minute, our heart can pump blood to every single cell in our body. And that's pretty cool when you think about it. And over the course of the day, we have about 100,000 heartbeats, and we move 2,000 gallons. Now that's 7,570 liters. So think about a 950 milliliter bottle of Gatorade, and our heart is moving over 7,500 of those. And we're sending that blood through 60,000 miles of branching blood vessels that link our cells, our organs, and our body parts. So pretty amazing stuff. Figure 12.2 illustrates the heart anatomy and the blood flow through the heart. So our blood, deoxygenated blood, returns to the heart through our superior vena cava, and it enters the right atrium, and it's going to pass through tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then it's sent to the lungs via our pulmonary artery. In the lungs, the blood releases CO2 and it replenishes O2 or oxygen, and then it flows through our pulmonary veins into our left atrium, and then it travels through the bicuspid valve into our left ventricle, and then it's going to travel up through our aortic artery, and it's going to be into the aorta and delivered to the body and the tissues. Now, when our atria contract, so our right atrium and our left atrium, that is when systole or systole occurs, and the blood is sent to the ventricles. And blood flows into the ventricles during diastole or diastole, and that represents when the heart is relaxed. When the ventricles are filled up, that's called our end diastolic volume, or EDV. And then the ventricles contract and the heart pushes the blood either towards the lungs or towards the body. The amount of blood pumped per heartbeat has a term, and it's called the ejection fraction, or EF for short. So does our ejection fraction increase during exercise? Well, for sure it does. And we're going to talk about why as we go through the lecture today. So here we're looking at cardiac output, and this is a critical equation in exercise physiology. If you're not familiar with the terms, we're going to go through each one. So cardiac output equals our heart rate times stroke volume. Cardiac output is often also written as a Q with a dot above it. What about stroke volume? Stroke volume is the amount of blood per beat, and our heart rate is the number of beats per minute. So our cardiac output takes into account both the heart rate and the stroke volume. So maybe you're curious as to what type of cardiac output you might have. Well, this table 12.1, we're looking at cardiac output values for an average college male at rest and during heavy exercise. So we're going to zero in on our data under the Q here. Remember, that's our cardiac output. And we're going to look at resting values first. So our cardiac output is around 5.4 liters per minute. If you're a smaller individual, you're going to have less blood. If it's a larger individual, you're going to have a bit more. If you're a very highly trained endurance athlete, a bit more than that as well. But generally around 5 liters per minute, give or take a bit. Our heart rate at rest is 72 beats per minute. And then next we'll look at our stroke volume, and it's measured in milliliters per beat, and it's around 75 milliliters per beat. So if we take our 72 times 75, we get 5,400 milliliters per minute. But cardiac output is always expressed in liters per minute. So we convert our 5,400 milliliters into 5.4 liters per minute. So think about how big a 4-liter jug of milk is, and that your heart is pushing greater than that amount of blood around every minute. When we look at heavy exercise, below we can see how our heart rate increases substantially, as well as the stroke volume increases, and therefore our cardiac output increases by about 4 times. Just so you're also aware, an elite athlete can reach up to 40 liters per minute. Highly trained can get up to around 30 liters per minute. So here we're looking at the average college-age male. Next, we'll talk about our skeletal muscle pulp. And I want you to think about the back of your leg. Let's take the lower leg and your calf muscles. So when you exercise, your muscles are contracting, and they're going to squeeze your veins, and that's going to help push blood back to the heart. When we're exercising, our heart is contracting and it's pushing blood to the working muscles, and then the muscles gobble up all the oxygen from the blood. And once they're done consuming oxygen, it needs to send the blood back to the heart. But our veins need help. They're not as elastic as our arteries are. Our veins do have one-way valves that we can see here, so it allows blood to travel through, but doesn't allow blood to go backwards. Again, the veins need help pushing that blood forward, and that's where our contracting muscles come in. So this rhythmic contraction and relaxation of our muscles that helps with our venous return. This is referred to as our skeletal muscle pump. So this is why aerobic exercise and other exercises that involve alternating contraction and relaxation phases in our muscle groups, that's why those are preferable to our isometric straining exercise where you're holding that contraction for a long period of time. It's because we're not getting that rhythmic contraction and relaxation, and so it can prevent blood from returning back to the heart. Next, we're going to look at the human respiratory or pulmonary system. And depending on what book you read or which text you're looking at, these terms can be used interchangeably, respiratory and pulmonary system. This system also involves our nose and throat and the lungs. And what is respiration? So respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the cells of an organism and the external environment. Now, external respiration is a term. It's the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs. When you hear external respiration, it sounds like something that's happening outside the body, but it's not. Internal respiration is the exchange of these gases at the cellular or tissue level. So, our conducting portion of the respiratory system consists of highly branched, hollow tubes going from the nose and mouth to little sacs in the lungs called alveoli. And alveoli almost look like grapes. We can see a little side picture below here showing the alveoli. And the alveoli are round and they're all squished together. If we were to cut them open and flatten them all out, all of our alveoli, they would cover the surface area of about a football field because we have millions of them, millions of alveoli. Our air enters through the nose and mouth, and then it moves through the pharynx, larynx, trachea, left and right bronchi, and bronchioles, and into those alveoli that we just talked about. And the alveoli are tiny, thin-walled, hollow sacs, and that's where gas exchange takes place. And like I mentioned, we've got millions of those alveoli. When we look at the lungs, our lungs can handle about 4 to 6 liters of air. And it's a very large, moist surface. Our alveoli are those thin-walled, tiny elastic sacs, and that's where our gas exchange occurs from. And then we've got capillaries, and capillaries are like you draped a spider web over a grape, but at a microscopic level. So if the grape is the alveoli and the spider web is the capillaries, we have this network of capillaries that allows gas exchange. So respiration maintains a fairly constant favorable pressure gradient for exchange of O2, oxygen, and CO2, carbon dioxide, between the capillaries and alveoli. And what allows this to occur is our law of diffusion. Now let's look at the mechanics of breathing. And there is a rule. So the rule is air molecules move from an area of high pressure to an area of lower pressure. And with inspiration, the diaphragm and our external intercostal muscles contract to increase the volume within the thoracic cavity. And this, in turn, increases the volume within the lungs. When we're exercising hard, the sternocleidomastoid and the scalenes can assist, but while you're sitting there watching this video, it's mostly just your diaphragm and your external intercostals that are working. So the increased volume results in a decreased pressure, and if your airway is open, then air moves into the lungs and into the alveoli, as the air pressure in the alveoli is less than the air pressure out in the atmosphere. So air flows in. When our diaphragm contracts, it pushes down on the viscera, and this increases the volume of the thoracic cavity and decreases the pressure in our lungs, and again, it allows the air to flow in. Expiration is mostly passive. Again, when we're exercising intensely, we can use our rectus abdominis and our intercostal muscles to help breathe out. But typically it's passive. The diaphragm and external intercostal muscles relax, and that decreases the volume of the thoracic cavity. And as the lung tissues recoil, air pressure in the alveoli becomes greater than it is outside, or than atmospheric pressure, and air is forced out of the alveoli. Again, at rest, expiration is a passive process. The diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles are just relaxing. And remember, we're following the rule that air molecules are going to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. So figure 12.4 shows our diaphragm. We've got our diagram here, and that when the diaphragm contracts, it flattens, and that's going to increase the volume within the thoracic cavity. It's going to decrease the pressure and allow air to flow in. And then when our diaphragm relaxes, it's going to return to its parachute or dome shape. It's going to decrease the volume within the thoracic cavity, and it's going to force air out. Now, when you think about all of the muscles in our body and think about which muscle is the most endurance based, well, it's got to be the diaphragm, because it is always contracting. So here we've got another equation. We went through the equation with cardiac output before. Another key concept or key equation is our minute ventilation. And minute ventilation is our tidal volume times respiratory frequency. When we see ventilation, we think about exchange of air. We think about breathing. And then we've got our two subterms. We've got the term tidal volume. Now remember, with our cardiac output, we had stroke volume, which was the amount of blood pumped per heartbeat. The tidal volume is somewhat similar, but it's the air that is ventilated per breath. With cardiac output, we had heart rate. Well, what about our breathing rate? Well, respiratory frequency is similar conceptually. So our respiratory frequency is our number of breaths per minute. So with our equation, minute ventilation, tidal volume times respiratory frequency, we can measure it. When we did cardiac output, its stroke volume is difficult to measure without having a lab or an ultrasound. Tidal volume, we also need the lab, but it's a lot easier to measure than it is stroke volume. We'll use something called a spirometer to measure tidal volume. So we can measure the amount of air breathed in and breathed out with each breath. So again, we mentioned respiratory frequency, number of breaths per minute. Why don't you pause the video for a minute here and just breathe normally and count how many breaths you have in 1 minute. So again, our minute ventilation calculated by our tidal volume and our respiratory frequency. On table 12.2, we see typical minute ventilation values. So our typical resting value, here's rest over here, is around 6 liters per minute. So it's pretty similar to our cardiac output. Remember, it was 5.4. But now we're talking about air. We're not talking about blood anymore. The tidal volume is about 0.5 liters per minute. And on average, we take about 12 breaths per minute. Some people breathe 6 times, some people up to 20. But the average in a college-age male is around 12 breaths per minute. Is there such a thing as 0 breaths per minute? No. So we should always have a numerical value for breaths per minute. Now, let's look at breathing during heavy exercise. Substantially larger, so 150 liters per minute of air exchange. And that's a huge jump, quite a big difference. And the reason for that is our tidal volume goes up considerably, about 5 times, and our breathing frequency goes up about 5 times as well. So we multiply both those components, 2.5 times 60, and we end up with 150. And our units are liters per minute for this equation, not milliliters like our cardiac output. Next, we're going to look at minute ventilation versus oxygen consumption. So when we're looking at the slide here, we ask the question, where would you begin to fail the talk test? So during our light to moderate exercise, minute ventilation increases linearly as workload goes up or workload increases. Workload is on the bottom here. It's on the x-axis, and it goes from low to high. At moderate to heavy workloads, minute ventilation starts to increase out of proportion to workload. So usually our minute ventilation begins to increase more rapidly when the workload requires 75 to 80% of our maximum oxygen uptake, or VO2 max, and around 85% of our max heart rate. So when our workload starts to increase more rapidly, we're talking about a threshold. So here is our threshold right here. If someone's working harder and harder and they were talking, say they're running and they're talking with their running partner, but they're increasing their speed, eventually they're going to reach an intensity where they can no longer talk. They're going to fail the talk test. So in this slide, it's around 85% of their maximum heart rate. Someone that is less trained, we might see the curve come up even sooner than that. It might be maybe around 65% or so of their max heart rate. So this is an opportune time to look back at table 3.4 again and just refresh ourselves with the ways that we look at intensity of exercise, especially endurance. So on the left, we can see percentage of our max heart rate. We don't typically use percentage of VO2 maximum when we're prescribing intensity of exercise, because we often don't know what a person's VO2 max is. We might, however, use percentage of heart rate reserve because it is well correlated with a VO2 max. Rating of perceived exertion, or RPE, if somebody's exercising at 15, for example, that's going to be considered hard. So you don't need to memorize this chart, but you do know how to read it and apply it. So we're going to take a break here, and then we'll continue on with chapter 12.